that they're coming back to worship in the temple in Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Encouraging them to do so.
Yep, exactly. Everything has been focused on the nation of Israel, either condemning their sin toward God and one another, or in pointing out the judgment that's coming against them and or promising the gospel, the eventual restoration and the coming of the Messiah. Now, the rest of the nations of the world around them are brought into this prophecy, and we're given pictures of what part those nations of the world will play. And there are a couple of reasons that that's significant. One is, God wants his people to know that his providence extends over all things, not simply over them. There's nothing that's happening that's somehow outside of his control and his loving care for them. He's not surprised by anything. And the second, I think, is tentatively to start, I wouldn't say to start, because there's other places where this is true, but to say that, to bring us back to that promise of Abraham, that just as the providence of God extends over all things and over all people, so the salvation of God promised in the Messiah and its coming extends over all people. And that's why, even as they face judgment here, the nations are brought into this picture of the history of salvation. Because this history is really theirs, it's really yours too. I think those are the kind of the two overarching reasons that you get this shift. And more than that, of course, these prophecies are wide-ranging, and they're wide-ranging enough so that they extend not only to Isaiah's immediate day, but to nations, peoples, kingdoms that haven't even really yet emerged on the world stage. And in that way, God is vindicating himself to say, and in fact, these chapters 13 to 23, they are a major bone of contention within Isaiah studies because they depict events that happen so far into or after Isaiah's actual life, okay? And they depict events, the rising and falling of kingdoms so far after him that the only argument that you could make from a secular perspective is, well, there have to be like 3 authors, and then some guy sits down in a room somewhere and he finally puts all those pieces together and assembles them into the present compilation that we have. The reason for that, of course, is that if you're a secular scholar, you are immediately biased against a supernatural interpretation. If I say to you, I think these are so accurate because God made them so, the secularist says, well, that's ridiculous. That's fairy dust. You might as well say Santa Claus wrote these prophecies, right? There's a bias against the supernatural from the outset. And when you eliminate that, when you take God's supernatural providence out of account, you have to have a worldly explanation. We simply take the simplest reading, which is to say, the reason that these things are so accurate is that God himself has inspired the writer to be able to proclaim them for the comfort of his people. Okay, so that's where we're headed. Any questions or thoughts about what we've covered in Isaiah so far? Any questions about the section that we're going into, the oracles of the nations, or anything like that?
Sure. Not specifically about that, but you see, God, and this is always kind of puzzled me.
Okay.
How does God inspire someone to write something specific?
That's a great question. And I think to give an exact answer would be hard. I welcome any observations if you've maybe studied the doctrine of inspiration a little more closely. But I think the first place I always look to is in the scriptures themselves. When you say, how does God inspire? One of the things that sometimes you will, in the prophets especially, right? You will start a prophetic word with the phrase, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, right? Or whoever. Okay, the word of the Lord came. And at that point you would say, well, clearly then the inspiration is a kind of, I think, verbal communication, right? That's being given. Another thing you get is you get this in the prophets, and especially at the end of the scriptures in the book of Revelation, John saw. That is, you're going to get it here in a minute here. A lot of these oracles are things that the prophet really sees, right? And he's able to see the vision. And we assume that with that seeing comes a kind of interpretive capacity, that the pictures that flash before him make sense in a way that he can relate in words, whether that's